No matter what they say, it's still Crystal Lake to me.
Welcome back to You're All Doomed, the podcast that sliced and diced its way through all 12 Friday the 13th movies, 13 minutes at a time. And now we're never podcasting alone. I'm Brian.
And I'm wilderness parkour expert Greg.
And thank you to the Jasons for this episode's opening theme. We'll talk about them more at the end of this episode. So anyone that's been keeping up with the podcast has probably figured out that we are officially out of Friday the 13th movies to talk about. So we thought it would be a good time to kind of, in the downtime, talk about some of the fan films that are out there. And the most popular one that listeners were reaching out to us about, and the one that we were most familiar with, was the one we decided to start off with, which is Never Hike Alone.
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit in a previous season, how we were kind of resistant to the idea of covering fan films because, you know, we tend to get pretty sarcastic when we talk about the Jason movies, and I was a little bit worried about coming down hard on projects that people spent their own money on and weren't making money from. We're doing it just, you know, for their own enjoyment or to just keep the franchise alive while they wait for an official studio release. But, you know, you and I were on that live stream that Loot Fright hosted back in August, and we happened to be on that with Vincent DiSanti, who wrote and directed and starred in this fan film, and he kind of talked us into doing it. So that made me a little bit more enthusiastic, hearing that, you know, a creator of one of these would actually be interested in having it discussed on a podcast by two guys who have no idea how to make a movie. So, you know, he made some good points, and I was much more interested in what he had to say about Jason through his movies than I was before we had a chance to talk with him.
Yeah, I really liked his stance of just like, the fans are keeping this alive, and in order for these movies to continue to be seen, the fans need to keep the fan films alive. And so this was one way to do it, was to talk about it. And we've got a short list of some movies that we'll get to. We'll scatter it around our other recordings just so we can still have a smattering of Friday the 13th content while we wait for a new movie. But like I said, the fans, the listeners were the ones that reached out and were like, you got to do Never Hike Alone. You got to do Never Hike Alone. So that's where we are. Yeah,
this is like the gold standard, apparently, of the fan films. So let's kick it off with this.
It's a Womp Stomp Films production. So Womp Stomp is a film production company that was founded by Vincent DiSanti and co-founded by Kyle Klein. Also, Austin Benang and Ben Meredith are part of the crew. And they're really the champions. They're the biggest advocates of kind of like the fan film community of keeping the Friday the 13th spirit alive. And they're very active on social media. And every time there's new Friday the 13th news, they're raising their hands like, hey, we'd love to do it. Or anytime there's rumors about new Friday the 13th stories, there's people outside of Womp Stomp Films that are commenting on social media like, oh, you got to get the Womp Stomp guys to do this. It'd be awesome. So they definitely have carved out a nice little spot for them in this arena. And this was technically their first entry. We'll kind of get into other things that they've done in other episodes. But for the sake of, I guess, continuity, we're going to start with Never Hike Alone, which is like the first feature length film that they did.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It just occurred to me that like Paramount has an interesting history with fan films because like Star Trek was kind of the one that really put fan films on the map as a way to keep a franchise going between official releases and to kind of gauge interest in a new series potentially. And they kind of let people, you know, go with, as long as they weren't making money off something, they kind of let them put stuff out there on a fan basis. But then there was one really well-regarded fan film back in, like, I'm thinking it was like 2016 or something, that was getting a lot of attention, almost like Never Hike Alone has, and Paramount stomped down on it and prevented it from being released. And so there's a tricky balance these guys have to strike, I bet, with getting a little too popular and having the studios get worried about the intellectual property. But so far, it seems like their approach has been right on and just keeping people enthusiastic about Jason.
I do wonder how movies like this kind of skate by any kind of like persecution from the intellectual property holders, because you get people that'll post a video on YouTube that has like a song by a popular group or something in the background, and YouTube takes that thing down in 5 seconds.
Right.
But then you can have a podcast where you can play that music on the podcast as long as you're talking about the song that you're playing. And it's like, it's all context, but there's nothing in these fan films that we've seen where it's like, hey, this is safe because we don't have a killer in a hockey mask. Like basically the legal rights that are being fought over right now, which is like who belongs or like what idea belongs to what person. So It's like, no, you've got like full on Jason in a hockey mask and they're referring to him as his name. They're talking about his story. There's even similar music. And so I like to think that it is Paramount or whoever still owns the rights to Friday the 13th saying, like agreeing with Womp Stomp's kind of like mission statement, which is like, hey, any press, any coverage that we can get from our intellectual property is good for us because it's keeping the story alive so that when it finally is time to make a new movie, it's out there.
Right.
But I can absolutely see a production company or a studio being like, hey, you got to take this shit down. And so it's really interesting what the loopholes are and how are they getting through it. Is it really just subjective and it just depends on what the studio thinks or what one person thinks? Or is it really just, are they doing something that's 100% allowed to be done?
Right. Well, there's probably a couple things going on in this instance, whereas like nobody knows who owns the rights that they would then have to protect. So that there's not, like nobody can get a consensus on who would go after these fan productions. And the other side of it is that, even if there was somebody that, would be inclined to go after these guys, they can't make their own movie right now. They can't make an official Friday the 13th right now. So there's no real competition going on here. If the franchise was still active and, they had something in development right now, they'd probably be a little more stingy about somebody putting out a high quality fan film like this. But, I'm not an entertainment lawyer, so who the hell knows?
Well, I think some of the rationale can actually be explained in the disclaimer that kind of pops up at the beginning of the movie. And it says, this is just part of the disclaimer, but it says, this project was created by fans to show our appreciation for the Friday the 13th franchise. As of Friday the 13th, October 2017, which was probably when this movie came out, this project is free and available to all who care to watch it, and no profit shall be made from its viewing. So that's probably huge right there. And thank you to any and all who have assisted in bringing the project to life. Womp Stomp Films is forever grateful for your time and dedication to the project. So yeah, that's probably the biggest thing is like, they're not making any money. You can just go on YouTube, you can watch it. I think there's ways that you can buy the Blu-ray, but I think it all goes toward the production of the movie. So I think that could be like the little loophole that they're getting through, but there's no,
like it's not for profit in the sense that they're, using it to buy a boat.
Right.
Unless they need a boat for the next movie that,
the Womp Stomp yacht that's out.
Yeah, right.
So the movie kicks off with a car driving down a mountainous road, which it immediately cracked me up because how many of these Friday the 13th movies have started with a car driving down the road? But Greg, you and I had a side conversation earlier where it was driving me nuts because I couldn't figure out what type of car it was. Like I knew it looked familiar and I was like, I got to keep it up. Like all these different movies that we've done, I've always been the guy that's pointing out the cars. And I'm not a car guy at all. It just was more curiosity for me to kind of pick out what it was. And so I couldn't figure out what it was. So I actually reached out to Vincent DiSanti on Instagram and I was like, Vince, there was two reasons why I reached out to him. The first one was I was like, we're doing this for the podcast. I got a really quick question for you. What kind of car is it? It's really cool. So he told me it's a early to mid 70s Ford Bronco. So they're really cool. And actually, if you go online now and try to find like mint condition, those Ford Broncos, they're like $250,000. So they're like huge collector's items.
Especially if OJ is hiding in the back of them.
Right. The other one was, and this happened around the same time, is I got this ad on Instagram for like, I think it was Alka-Seltzer. And it was just like this really short video of this like disheveled looking dude. Like, I think it was supposed to kind of posit that he had been out all night drinking and he was taking Alka-Seltzer to feel better. And it looked exactly like Vincent DiSanti. And I even sent the picture to you, Greg. Yeah. I was like, look at this guy. Doesn't he look exactly like Vincent? And you're like, 100%. So I sent the photo to Vincent in the same conversation. I was like, also, is this you? And he just said, LOL, no, that's not me. So it's a doppelganger, but it was just so funny. It all happened at the same time. But so yeah, two random questions. So Vince, if you are listening, I thank you very much for your patience.
And don't block Brian on Instagram.
Right. But yeah, so it's this really cool, like kind of open top Ford Bronco, very driving down the road, very reminiscent of the many Friday the 13th movies we've seen in the past. Another thing I got from this opening is it had kind of strong The Shining vibes. It was the wilderness, the way it was shot.
Well, and the lake even has a little island in the center of it, which the lake at the beginning of The Shining, it turns out that's St. Mary Lake in Glacier National Park, where I'm headed this summer for a vacation. So I'm totally going to go check that location out. But you're absolutely right. That was the first thing I thought of, that kind of iconic Kubrick opening alongside the lakefront.
There's a bunch of credits that go by too. One of them is that the screenplay was by Vincente DiSanti and Nathan McLeod, which was based on characters created by Sean Cunningham, Victor Miller, and Ron Kurtz. So they're just kind of covering all their bases there. So the car eventually parks on the side of a mountainous trail, and we get a selfie cam view of Kyle MacLeod. He's filming the latest installment of his web series. I can't tell if it's called Glorious Backcountry Adventure or if that's just what he's describing what he's doing on that particular day. But
or Glory Holes of America. Yeah, I mean, Kyle's a young, adventurous kind of extreme video influencer type. So, I mean, he's obviously done stuff like this before, and he seems like he's an experienced, well-known woodsman.
He's definitely speaking to his established audience because it sounds like they know him and what he's been up to in the past. On this particular adventure, he's going to be going through Wessex County National Forest, which apparently is home to one of the most diverse ecosystem in the Catskills. So we're kind of establishing a slightly different environment than what we're used to seeing in the past.
Yeah, that was something that kind of jumped out at me with this whole project, is that it's much more remote than my impression of Crystal Lake was in previous Jason movies. And, I like the conceit of this movie that we'll come to discuss, but I found it odd that Crystal Lake is so difficult to get to if there's going to be a camp there.
Yeah, we can get into that a little bit later. The way I was kind of viewing this is that he does mention that it's a 45-mile loop around the lake, and that he expects it to take at least a few days to go around. So I'm kind of imagining that he's coming in from an angle that you wouldn't necessarily do if you were going directly to camp. So he's just taking an indirect route there. But right. I agree. Everything looks a little bit different so far. Okay. We can go into the differences a little bit later.
Well, yeah, we don't know where he's coming from. So if Crystal Lake Camp is on, like, let's say the south side of the lake, the South Shore, and he's coming from, New England or something, coming in on the North Shore of the lake, he's got to go all the way around it, basically. So, yeah, that makes sense.
I did like at one point that Kyle points out that the trail that he's about to go on is not for the faint of heart, and it's only for intermediate to advanced level hikers. And he even calls out one of his newbie hiker subscribers called Hikerman 5000. And I'm just wondering what the 5000 stands for.
Chicks he's banged.
So then Kyle says he expects it's going to take about 8 hours for him to get to his first rendezvous spot on the South Lake summit, and that sunset is in roughly 7 hours from now.
And he intends to make up this time by running through the woods at full speed.
He is hauling ass.
and jumping over rocks. And I mean, it's just insane how, I mean, I enjoy a nice hike. My wife and I did one this morning, in fact, around a little former gravel pit near our house. And it's delightful. But I mean, this guy, even just watching this guy jump around and run like he is, makes me tired as shit.
There was music blasting the whole time he was doing this, but I totally imagine him going, parkour, parkour, the whole time that he was doing it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what's the most rigorous hike you've ever done?
I mean, nothing like that. I mean, this is what I would consider extreme hiking, where he's really hauling ass. Now, he does have a purpose. He's trying to make up time because he's apparently not gonna make it in time before the sun goes down. But so nothing this rigorous. I know one of the most annoying hikes that I went on was in England. We were visiting my oldest brother and his family. They were living there at the time, and we went to the Cliffs of Dover, which people have probably seen pictures of, the White Cliffs of Dover. And we drove there one day, and it's not, I mean, you can hike there, but it's mostly just like, oh, wow, look at these cliffs. Aren't they cool? But my sister-in-law wanted to go to this lighthouse that she had spotted only once we got there. This was not something that we had planned in advance. So we parked the car and we walked around a little bit, and she sees this lighthouse, and it's a good 2 miles away, at least. And it's England in November. It's raining. It's already kind of like late afternoon, so it's getting kind of dark. And she's like, well, let's just walk to this lighthouse, which is like, it's not a treacherous trail by any means. It was just kind of like a long grass trail that you had to go through, but it was raining and it was dark. And it's like, it's going to take us forever to get there. And so none of us, except my sister-in-law, wanted to do it. It's my oldest brother and my nephew, who was probably like 10 or 11 at the time. And so we're just bitching and moaning the whole time, and we're just hiking there. And we finally get to the lighthouse, and it's closed.
No, motherfucker.
And the guy's like, no, actually, we're getting ready to close up shop. But my sister-in-law somehow convinced him to let us take one more tour. We're like, we still have to get back, and the sun is down and it's dark, and we don't know we don't know where we're going. It's not like this trail is lit or anything. So we were just like, all right, great. It's a lighthouse. Really cool. Let's go. And so we just hiked back, just completely miserable, got in the car. None of us talked. We were just like, even now we still joke about that stupid lighthouse that we went to.
And one of you was attacked by a werewolf, so you wound up being...
Right. Regardless, Kyle's extreme hiking efforts pay off because he's made it to his rendezvous point just as the sun is starting to go down. And that's when we get like a nighttime campsite scene.
One of the things that Kyle's doing while he's in his tent this evening is attempting to sell products from some of his channel sponsors. This is a little collapsible camping shovel that he's attempting to use. And it sounds like he thinks it's kind of a piece of crap.
Well, he mentions that it's like a 3-piece collapsible shovel, and maybe I misinterpreted it, but it made it seem like it was like a multi-tool. It wasn't just a shovel. Mm-hmm. And so I think one is probably like, it probably has like a chopping blade for small branches or something, and then the shovel obviously for digging. And I was trying to figure out what the third one might be.
It looked to me like it had a pickaxe edge on the back of the shovel, part. And then I wondered if maybe it had like a little bit of a hammer spot for like pounding tent stakes into the ground or something. But no, I mean, he doesn't really get to do his full spiel for his channel. So I didn't get to see what exactly features this thing had.
Like a built-in compass or something.
Right. Or a fleshlight.
Never pitch a tent alone.
At one point, he's interrupted because he hears some wolves or coyotes in the distance, but they don't sound too far away. And he's, kind of, I think he even douses his light a little bit, and he's like, "Oh, let's listen." And he hears these tough woodland predators apparently on the hunt for something, and then you hear kind of them of one of them or all of them being killed by whatever they were hunting. So that adds a little bit of a sinister tone to this night. I mean, we can assume, spoilers, that this is probably Jason killing these these coyotes or wolves. And I was sort of wondering, like, were they hunting something and that come to find out it was Jason, so he kicked their asses, or was he out hunting the wolves or coyotes for food?
Oh, interesting. Right. Yeah, I just kind of figured, those are two, neither of those things I considered. The one I was thinking was more like Jason was nearby and the coyotes were making noise, doing whatever they were doing. And Jason's like, shut the fuck up. I'm trying to stalk
I like
here.
That. I like that.
So it was more just like collateral damage. Like, hey, I'm here. Get out of here kind of thing. But yeah, I think any of those scenarios are pretty cool.
You should Instagram Vince and ask him what he intended.
The next morning, Kyle finds an old trail marker that's not in his guidebook. So even though it wasn't part of his original plan, he decides to go check it out. And he doesn't get very far before he comes upon a barbed wire fence with a no trespassing sign hung on it.
And there was a weird jump scare here that it's very much in the style of these movies. So I don't fault Vincent DiSanti for putting it in, but it's one of those things where, like, you see a figure appear behind Kyle, but when he whips around, there's no one there. So was it ever really there, or was it just Kyle thinking he saw something? Or I never really like those kinds of jump scares because they feel a little bit like they cheat.
Mm-hmm. Well, it freaked him out enough that he pulled his knife. So he either sensed something or heard something close enough that he felt the need to defend himself. So that's why, yeah, I agree. It's like we as the viewer see something right next to Kyle, but then he turns around and no one's there. And it's like, well, that's not really fair.
Yeah, I mean, I would have almost preferred it if you just simply heard something and Kyle got freaked. And because he's an experienced woodsman, we could infer that the noise he heard was not a usual woodland sound or something. But as it was presented, it just was like, well, did that really happen? Was Jason really right there? Or was this guy just imagining things?
Well, this might be a good time to ask. So would you ever hike alone?
Well, no, because I take the advice of this title to heart. No. I mean, and not even like because I'd be afraid of Jason, unless I was, walking around in Wessex County, New Jersey. But I mean, I'd go on a hike, like down at the gravel pit that we were at today. Cause it's clearly marked paths. It's, wide open. So like if you were to get hurt or something, someone would be able to find you easily. I wouldn't go off into the wilderness by myself, if, especially like where I'm like running around and jumping over rocks and shit. Cause you could easily get hurt or lost. I mean, I'm not out there. I'm out there to like spend time chatting with whoever I'm hiking with in a serene environment. I'm not out there to like experience the silence of nature and, feel my blood pump as I jump down 60 feet of a cliff, and that's not me. What about you?
I feel the same way. The thing that I equated it to was running. So I run a lot, and sometimes I'm out running for 3 or 4 hours because I'm an idiot. And I live in Chicago, so it's not exactly remote, but I have multiple places that I go running. Some are more populated than others. And there's one particular paved trail that's very long that I'll go on, but I do tend to not go on that trail if I'm going to be running for a long period of time, because there's not a lot of access points for people to get to me. So like, I'm not always thinking like worst case scenario, but if I like trip and break my ankle or something, it's not going to be easy for someone to get to me. It's not like I'm going to rot and die out there. Like someone will get to me. I'm more concerned about like my wife being able to like pick me up and take me to the emergency room or something. So it's like, I do tend to think like, okay, how long am I going to be out? How far am I going to be from home? And how easy is it going to be for someone to get to me? Because like most of my runs I'll do along Lake Michigan, along this like 20-mile trail, and there's access points like at least every like half mile at the very least. And so if something were to happen, aside from the thousands of people that are out there with me, it would be easy for someone to get to me. So like, that's kind of like what I equated it to, was like, I don't know if I feel comfortable enough to just like go off where no one can find me for long periods of time, because I would be concerned, like, okay, well, what would happen if I fell or someone in a hockey mask was chasing me? Like, how would I get out of there?
I love the implicit male privilege of this conversation. There are probably women who are listening to this who are like, no, assholes, we can't hike alone because there's always some creep around who is going to make things either uncomfortable or unsafe for us. So fuck off.
Very true. But back to the scene with Kyle after the fake out jump scare. He decides to cut through the fenced off area and catch up to a different trail on the other side of the lake. And as we see Kyle disappear into the woods, we do get an actual quick shot of Jason stepping into the frame.
Right.
So we know he's nearby.
Right. So he's able to pull a Batman and disappear when, you know, anyone turns around after talking to him.
I do like that later in the day, as Kyle's hiking through the woods, we do see his like confidence suddenly shaken, like he's made maybe a poor decision going off of the guidebook, or not following the guidebook. He just seems a little like, I don't really know where I am. I don't know what I'm doing. This may not have been the greatest idea.
Yeah, the bravado that he had earlier has definitely been undercut somewhat, and that is interesting. He's starting to get a little bit more thoughtful about his actions now that he realizes he's maybe made a pretty big mistake.
I do get the feeling that he takes a shortcut, like he veers off the trail that he was on and tries to get back to the trail that he was planning on going to, because he climbs over like a rock face and finds himself down at the lake, which I think is where he said he was trying to get to in the first place. So he seems a little bit more calm now that he's in kind of like more familiar territory, or at least back to where he was expecting to be to begin with, because the sun is starting to go down.
He's a little more geographically oriented now.
Before it gets too dark, Kyle chops some firewood, and as he's heading back to his campsite, he trips over something, and it's an old sign that says Camp Crystal Lake.
This is a moment where I wish that I had not known this was a Jason movie. Watching, you know, and like, oh, awesome, sort of like how when we were seeing trailers for that movie The Woods, and then all of a sudden they revealed right before it came out that it was a Blair Witch sequel. Turned out to be underwhelming, but kind of that like, holy shit, this is something, you know, I would have loved to sit down to watch this thinking, oh, this seems like something I would like because it might remind me of a Jason movie, and then I find out it actually is a Jason movie. That would have been a thrilling moment.
I like that. Kind of like how they've been retrofitting Cloverfield movies into existing properties to like connect the universe. I do like that idea. Yeah, I'm a big sucker for like surprises like that, where you think you're going into one thing, it's marketed as something different, and then you go in and you're like, oh shit.
And that's another reason that having that little jump scare at the no trespassing sign, you know, was a shame, because, you know, I would have enjoyed. I tried to imagine myself watching this without knowing what it was, which is a Jason fan film, and that would have been really cool.
So Kyle is just as intrigued by the Camp Crystal Lake sign as we are, so he starts to record, which is probably what I would do if I was in the same situation. I'd be like, oh my God, check this out. He's basically in the campground, so he starts to wander around, and he's peeking in like a broken down cabin. There's doors off of hinges, boarded up windows, and this is one of many small touches that I really appreciated that we'll see in the next few moments. But there's caution tape covering one of the doors, which was just kind of like a nice little touch. It's very subtle, but it kind of says that, hey, something went down here. Mm-hmm.
At one point, as he's exploring the ruins of this camp, which frankly is in better condition than I would have imagined, he comes across the Playboy Summer Sex issue from July of 1980. My favorite detail about this is that it contains an interview with Bruce Jenner, who is of course now Caitlyn Jenner. So it seems like a collector's item. The fact that this magazine is there makes me laugh, because aside from the fact that the cover date is appropriate to the events of the original Friday the 13th movie, I almost wondered if this was a specific issue that Vincent DiSanti remembers from his youth and happened to still have this old copy from when he was a kid, and he wanted to put it in the movie because it makes sense that it would be there. So I wondered, like, do you have a favorite old porno mag from your teenage years that...
No, I don't. But just I wasn't expecting this question, but it just made me think of when I was in college, I got like a postcard in the mail or something from Playboy where it's like, hey, you get like 4 free issues, and then the catch is that after the 4 issues they want you to subscribe. And it was like right at the end of like spring semester or something, and I had moved back home for the summer and had my address changed, and so like the 4th and final free issue of Playboy got sent to my house. And my mom got the mail that day, and I had to explain to her, I'm like, no, Mom, seriously, it was just like this free offer, it's no big deal. But like in hindsight, I'm like, why would she care that I had a Playboy magazine? But I just remember this like disapproving look that she gave me when she like handed me the mail.
My little boy. I don't have one either, but there was one when I was in college, in one of the stalls of the dorm men's room. They would switch the floors of this building every year. So one year it would be guys living there, the next year would be women living there, the following year would be back to guys. And so all of the fixtures were basically unisex. But the stalls, because there would be intermittently be women there, they had those metal tampon holders that they could refill for the ladies' needs. But because it was a year where the guys were there, it was just this it was almost like an empty mailbox. And so one of the dudes who lived in that hall had a copy of a porno mag there that, never touch another man's porn. So I never like flipped through it or anything, but the cover was always facing out whenever you'd be in there taking a dump. And it was this this pretty hot, like slutty, porn girl, but I can't remember what magazine it was to track it down, because it wasn't like Playboy or Penthouse. It was one of those even like lower tier, like Swank or like Chunky Asses or something like that. But she's the one I always think of when I think of a porno mag, and I wish I could find her, just be like, oh, there she is, the bathroom girl.
Well, like you, I did the same research on that Playboy magazine to kind of figure out what it was, because we know as viewers that this movie is somehow connected to the Friday the 13th universe. And I was trying to figure out what they were trying to present here in terms of like a timeline. And so the July 1980 Playboy is just one thing. There was a calendar hanging on the wall that said June, and the first 12 days had been X'd out, leaving Friday the 13th open. But I looked closely and I couldn't really see a date on the calendar, but it looked like it was an old kind of like classical calendar. And then another thing that I noticed as Kyle was walking around is there was a box for a realistic TRC 471 AM FM cassette radio. And I looked it up, and it was a popular cassette radio player that was made in the late 70s. So it tracks to like 1980. So it's like, okay, so now I can kind of understand that what we're looking at are the ruins of Camp Crystal Lake following the events of Pamela Voorhees. At least that's what I was assuming from the beginning. And this is where we start to see more familiar details, at least people that are familiar with the Friday the 13th movies. So after Kyle is done soaking in the centerfold of the Playboy, he heads into the bathroom where he peeks behind the shower curtain to see that the stall is covered in dried blood. And I'm just presuming that this is where Marcy died in the original. The one thing that really kind of like clued that in for me was that they draw attention to a hanging metal light that's above the shower stall, which gets, if I'm not mistaken, gets hit by the axe when Pamela Voorhees swings it in the original. So like you're starting to see things that are familiar. And this is also, as far as I could tell, the first time we see a numbered ribbon hanging from the wall. It looks like it's just nailed on the wall. And this one was number 6. And I kind of pieced this together as the movie went on, but I'm guessing those are kind of like crime scene ribbons that are indicating where deaths took place.
Right.
And so once I saw that ribbon, then for the rest of the movie, I was trying to figure out, like looking for other ribbons. And I'm like, okay, who is that? Who is that? And trying to piece it together. So we'll get to those as they kind of like pop up. But
Yeah, it was much further along before I realized what they were, but that's such a cool detail.
Mm-hmm. I was a little surprised that Kyle wasn't too freaked out by the bloody shower stall. It was clearly dried blood and it had been there for a long time. So it's not like it was something that just happened. But I don't know if I had seen that, if I would want to continue exploring. I would probably been like, you know what? I think I'm probably good. I'm just going to get out of here.
Yeah, or at least think like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be here between the caution tape and the obvious signs of violence. Like, oh, maybe this is not cool for me to be poking around like this.
Especially since, and I may be wrong, but I don't think he's recording while he's doing this. I feel like that would at least justify him going further into all these different cabins, is if he was recording the whole time, be like, oh, check this out. Look, there's blood all over this shower stall. For his YouTube channel, that would make more sense. But he seems to be doing this for his own amusement. And that's why I was like, I'd probably check out after the bloody shower stall.
Yeah.
One of the rooms he gets into, I don't know if you noticed, but there's a hockey mask sitting on one of the shelves in the corner. It's not quite like Jason's, but it's more like the kind of like old school hockey mask that you would see in movies and stuff. But there's a nice little touch there.
Yeah, I liked that.
And then Kyle does something that I also would never do, which is look up the chimney of the fireplace. And he sees that something's stuck in there. And so he reaches up there and tries to grab it. I'm like, nope, I'm not doing that. But he does pull out a dead animal, and he eventually goes outside and chucks it in the woods. And as he's out there
using
in the
the shovel, I might add.
Oh, that's right.
So
yeah,
it's coming
true.
quite in handy.
Yep.
One thing that kind of jumped at him, he's clearly now in the main building of the camp, and there are, they obviously they didn't film this at Camp Novi Bosco in New Jersey, so the design of this room is much different, and there's this like kind of these large windows going up to the vaulted ceiling that weren't in the cabin that Alice was barricading herself into to protect herself. So it's, there's little things like that kind of jumped out at me, but overall it works, it works just fine.
Yeah. It's probably a good point to bring it up, because I didn't know how I feel about it, because it definitely doesn't look like the Camp Crystal Lake that I remember from the first movie. But then I also understand it can't be the camp. Like they just chose to film somewhere else, and that's fine. But there's enough in there that seems familiar to me that I'm willing to buy it, and willing to kind of dismiss the fact that there's huge mountains nearby. I'm trying to stay more localized in the cabins. And so when I see things, so like when he was out in the woods chucking the animal carcass away, as he's walking back, we get a quick view of one of those like crime scene ribbons, and it's hanging from a tree, and the camera pans up and we see the frayed remains of like a bloody rope. And I'm trying to think, I'm sure that's connected to someone from part one, but I can't think specifically who that would have been.
Steve Christie.
Oh, yeah.
He
Okay.
flops down from the tree. Yeah.
That's right. He was one of the pranks, I guess, that Jason had, right? Or Pamela had.
Or Pamela had, yeah, where Alice was running out of the cabin and then Steve flops down right in front of her.
Okay. Yeah, I figured if they were going to show these ribbons, they were going to make sure that it was connected to something specific, but I couldn't figure that one out. But Steve Christie makes sense. Kyle heads back into that main cabin and has now got a roaring fire going in the fireplace. And one thing I thought was funny is that now that he has his bandana off, he looks a lot like former Cincinnati Reds pitcher Bronson Arroyo. He's just got these like glowing locks of hair. And
Jeez, calm down on Bronson Arroyo, Brian. Get a room.
So Kyle is now speaking into the camera, and he's telling the familiar legend of Pamela Voorhees and Jason. And it's nothing that we haven't heard before. It's the standard story, so they're not really deviating from that. But he does think it's a shame that no one will ever get to appreciate this camp again because of this stupid ghost story, as he calls it. So he doesn't necessarily believe it, which I think is weird because he's already seen evidence so far that something did take place there. So it's not just a ghost story, but this version of the story is at least suggesting that once this Pamela Voorhees crime happened at Camp Crystal Lake, nobody went back there. And apparently no one has really been back there since. So like, that's kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it partly stretched credulity a little bit that the legend would be so well known by this guy so long after it happened. I mean, he, I guess maybe he did research because he was going there, I mean, but it just seemed like he knew an awful lot about it, and it was so long ago that it was a little bit jarring. But it did make me start thinking about local legends from where we grew up, and the only one that I could think of was the Screaming Statue, which was reputedly in our youth, a bunch of high school students claimed that a house near where you and I lived, near our neighborhood, had a fountain in their backyard that had some sort of sculpture that implied they were Satanists or something. And kids would constantly drive this family nuts by trespassing and I think in some cases even vandalizing this garden fountain. So the house put up no trespassing signs, and they let the foliage in their front yard go kind of wild to prevent people from climbing up there from the road. But I do remember one time when we were like, I don't know, we were like maybe 9 or, we were younger than teenagers. Well, let's say we were like 10 or 11 riding our bikes at around the intersection near where this house was located. And this carload of presumably drunk high school kids kind of screeches over to us and is like, "Hey kids, do you know where the Screaming Statue is?" And they were sort of like the high school toughs from a lame Stephen King movie or something. And we were young and little enough that we were kind of scared, and we were sort of like, "Oh yeah, I think it's over that way" and stuff. And then they like peeled out and they were going to go, but it was like the middle of the day, so I don't know what they thought they were going to get away with, but.
Yeah, that moment's been scarred in my memory as one of the most traumatic experiences. Yeah, they just drove by and like screamed that, and I don't even know if they stopped. I think they just screamed it as they drove by, and we didn't even have a chance to answer. But I do remember everything there is to know about the Screaming Statue. You know what's funny though is like in this day and age, I have never once thought to like look up that house on Google Maps to see if I could see the statue in their backyard or anything like that.
Have.
Oh, you have?
Yeah. Oh, I have. And I mean, I didn't see anything that was very clearly, like, oh my God, there it is, like this burning chasm to the depths of hell or something.
Your computer screen starts to like shudder and all the pixels start to burn out.
A hand reaches out from the monitor and grabs my face.
I love that you looked it up.
Now that he's told the story of this, it seems like Kyle's at a level of being creeped out enough that he actually has his camping knife out and ready, which I thought was a cool detail. Like he's definitely feeling uncomfortable as he looks around this place.
Yeah, I think he's in a different cabin than the one he was in before, because this time there's another ribbon hanging from the main door. And again, I'm trying to remember who that would have been. Probably someone that was pinned to the door.
That was probably Bill.
Yes. That's right. Okay. Yeah. All right. I'm just trying to keep track of all these. That would make sense.
So the ribbon should have been down by his nuts where the arrow was stuck in. He was pinned to the door and then he got shot in the nuts too.
I see. And there's also a little creative freedom here because as he's in the cabin, there's a bunk bed with bloody sheet and pillowcase, which we know as Jack.
Right.
So like it's not necessarily the same cabin, but we're at least starting to see some of these bodies start to pile up or the crimes start to pile up. And he even goes into the kitchen and he guesses that this is where Pamela used to prepare food for the kids, which is kind of cool because I never really considered that.
Right. That was a nice touch, calling back to the fact that she was the cook. Makes total sense. Although, I mean, again, it's like how many kids stay at this camp? Because you would think that a camp kitchen would be much more industrial and, like, because they have to prepare food for, dozens of children. So, like, I always kind of got the sense that the kitchen we see Alice making coffee in was the kitchen for the counselors and their lounge cabin, not necessarily like the full blown camp mess hall.
Right. I think the same thing. Yeah. So I have a what would you do scenario for you here. So as Kyle is in the kitchen, he hears some pounding coming from upstairs. What would you do?
I would absolutely take off my pants, go upstairs with no weaponry, and just kind of wander around going, "Hello? Is anyone there?"
That's so weird. That's exactly what I would do. No, I would get the fuck out of there. There's no way I'm going to investigate. But he does.
While he's upstairs, he discovers a door to nowhere, which is a second story or third story door that was, used in agricultural purposes to haul heavy things up to the second or third story of a house. But currently there's no stairway leading down from it or anything. Those always creeped me out. I've seen those in a couple of houses before. And the fact that you could open this door and just run out into open air always gave me the creeps. So I'm guessing they'll make use of that.
But he does, while he's up there, find a dark room in the back that it looks like someone might be living there. And he finds a prayer card, which I thought was kind of creepy. It goes, "A birthday prayer for you. If there's any joy that you wish for, God grant it may gladden your way. If there's any blessing you long for, may that be your gift for today. If there's any help you are needing for betterment, comfort, or cheer, God grant it be sent on your birthday to stay with you year after year." Which is sweet, but I think in the current setting, it's a little creepy.
Yeah, there's definitely some chilling, ominous atmosphere when you think about the fact that, today is his birthday. He was born on Friday the 13th.
And what makes this extra creepy is that while Kyle is reading this, a pair of booted feet appear behind him. And Kyle starts to smell something rotten as we hear flies buzzing around. And he pulls back a pair of bed sheets or a makeshift curtain and finds a rotten, severed head underneath. So when Kyle sees this severed head, he stumbles back and is grabbed by someone hiding behind that hanging curtain. And it's then that we get some shaky Blair Witch footage from Kyle's GoPro camera as he's dragged out of the cabin and tossed out of that second floor door that we saw before down onto the ground below. Kyle is now dazed a floor below outside the cabin, and he, of course, grabs his camera and starts to crawl away. Jason, meanwhile, has grabbed an axe, which seems more useful in this situation, and jumps out of the door from the second floor and is now stomping rather loudly toward crawling Kyle.
Yeah, here's where I start to have some thoughts. I mean, Jason is a bit too thumpy in this movie. It's, he's played by Vincent DiSanti. I can't blame Vincent for wanting to play Jason. And he's certainly got the height and he's sturdy enough looking. But I like Jason to be a little bit more limber. He's a little bit Frankenstein-y here almost, or maybe like Darth Vader as soon as he gets put into the suit at the end of Revenge of the Sith. So yeah, it's not quite what I would have hoped for. I kind of wish they'd gone a little bit more offbeat with Jason. I do like that he's got kind of the smooth, bald look instead of the wisps of hair that we've seen in more recent portrayals of Jason. But he's got this weird kind of blackened looking skin like he did in Freddy vs. Jason that I was not a fan of. And I thought that was a little bit of a, I don't love that so much. But, like I said, I can't blame Vincent for doing it. And it's great to see Jason back, period.
I felt like overall the appearance of Jason here was probably closest to part 6 Jason. It's a pretty classic look. He's not this hulking monster with huge deformities crawling around his mask or anything. So it's a pretty classic look. So yeah, other than the things you mentioned, I didn't have too many complaints about the appearance, but this is the first introduction of his stomping feet, which I feel get worse as the movie goes on, and it does Like, I have no problem with him creating a stomping sound when he walks, but I just feel like there were times where it just didn't match the type of footstep that he was taking. Like if he was like really like charging down through a cabin and there was a stomping sound effect, I'm willing to go with it.
Right.
But there's times where he like literally will just like turn around, and like that step that he takes to turn around is like, sounds like someone bashing down a door. And it's like, I would have liked that noise to be a little bit lower in the mix. It's just a little too in your face.
Yeah,
So
I know.
that's
what
probably
you mean.
my biggest complaint is, and that's not really, that's probably a good thing that my biggest complaint is like a sound design issue.
Sure. But I know what you mean. Like, I remember in Paranormal Activity toward the end, there's some stomping as Katie is coming back up the stairs. That's very effective and very creepy. And I could see them using Jason clomping up the stairs as this like, oh shit. But the fact that it's in with every motion he does seems a little bit over the top.
Yep.
His mask is lacking some of the red chevrons on the cheek panels, but I kind of like that because with the mask you saw on the shelf earlier, it implies that maybe there's like a bunch of hockey masks laying around, and that Jason just kind of grabs one whenever he feels the need to put one on, and he doesn't have like one that he keeps in his hip pocket, like he doesn't have one that he's wearing all the time. Which would explain why sometimes they look different from movie to movie. How do you feel about the idea of Jason coming back to live at the camp instead of like in a random shack in the woods?
Well, Kyle does kind of suggest that he may be the first. Kyle suggests that Kyle may be the first person back at the camp since the Pamela Voorhees murders. So if it truly has been deserted since 1980, I don't have too much of a problem with Jason being there, because it does not appear to be a place that's been like a hot tourist destination for hikers or whoever just happens to be out there, like, or curious teenagers. Like, there's no evidence of modern day markings. There's no graffiti or people leaving like camping equipment there or anything. So like, it really does seem like no one has been there, and it does seem remote enough that maybe people have just forgotten about it. They've seemingly blocked any of the access to this place. So I don't have too much of a problem with Jason staying there, because it's like,
logistically he could get away with it.
Right. Like there's no one stopping him from inhabiting one of the cabins, or forcing him to stay in a more remote location because there's so much traffic at the campground. So it's fine. I prefer the shack. I like the idea of him kind of like really being out in the wilderness and developing this home for himself rather than just squatting. But I don't have a huge problem with him still being there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I certainly, at this point, it's sort of been codified that that's where he lives. I mean, we talked about it a little bit with the reboot, he joking even that he maybe slept in his childhood bed, for God's sake. That, to me, that puts a little bit too much emphasis on him staying at the, like, hovering around the area. It almost makes it seem like he's easier to avoid getting in trouble with, because as long as you don't step foot on the campground, he won't mess with you. By contrast, if he's in a random shack in the woods, that implies that he kind of claims the whole area as his domain. And it's much creepier for me personally, thinking about, when you and I were growing up playing in the woods, if we came across a creepy old shack and there was this like mutated freak living in it who was going to kill us, as opposed to like, hey, let's not go to the haunted camp where we know people got killed. I don't know. I kind of like the randomness of Jason being in the woods nearby, as opposed to like going upstairs and closing his bedroom door that might still have posters from when he was a little kid, hanging
right
up.
Back to outside the cabin, I mentioned that Jason had grabbed an axe before he took off chasing Kyle, and he eventually catches up to Kyle right outside the cabin and takes a swing with the axe and narrowly misses giving Kyle the free circumcision. So he just misses him. But Kyle's able to jump up, and the two actually get into a boxing match, which was kind of cool because, again, this is probably something that considering the circumstances of who I was up against, I don't know if I would stand up and try to confront the guy. I would probably still try to run and get away. But Kyle's like, nope, I'm here. I'm going to try to take this guy out. So they get into like a brief boxing match.
Kyle gets hurled to the ground and manages to grab a pretty big rock that he swings and hits Jason in the face, which knocks off Jason's hockey mask. Kyle stands up and sees kind of a shadowed reveal of the ruin beneath Jason's mask. And it's not bad. It looks a little bit like the monster from Krull. But, you know, I mean, I'm glad to see that they're holding up their end of the bargain and with this movie and making Jason look kind of freaky underneath the mask. That's when Kyle books off into the woods, giving Jason a chance to put his mask back on. Now that Kyle doesn't have, his headband on or anything like that, you made mention that he reminds you of Bronson Arroyo. To me, he looked a lot like Thor, and I kept laughing at the idea of him whipping out Mjolnir and taking the Bifrost to safety.
Kyle ends up actually gaining quite a bit of ground on Jason by booking it through the woods, and which is fine because that was established earlier. We saw Kyle being able to handle himself in rough terrain. He cuts up his leg pretty badly, so he uses his bandana to stop the bleeding, but he hears Jason stomping nearby because everyone can hear Jason stomping. And he decides to hide behind a tree, so he's like temporarily out of sight from Jason until Jason sees Kyle's bloody bandana lying on the ground. And I don't understand this next scene. Maybe you can help me walk through this. So like Kyle is laying face first on the ground, and Jason has grabbed Kyle by the ankle. So Kyle is kind of like grasping at the ground in front of him. I think he even has his knife out that he's trying to like dig in.
Right.
And he's trying to pull himself away. And then it looks like he's trying to reach for a branch in front of him. So I figured he was going to try to like break off the branch and turn around and hit Jason with it. But instead, we get a shot of Jason swinging his machete, missing, and then Kyle is gone. He's absolutely nowhere to be seen. And I'm just not quite sure what happened there.
Yeah, you're right. It was Kyle evading certain death, but we're not exactly sure how. I almost wondered if, Jason kind of, as he swung down, kind of had to let go of the leg to kind of follow through with his other arm to give himself the leverage that he needed. And somehow Kyle managed to dodge it. Jason's aim seems kind of shitty in this movie. Mm-hmm. So that gave Kyle just enough of a chance to pull a Batman himself and vanish. But yeah, that was a little bit awkward.
The other thing I was wondering is, and it's not really presented this way visually, but it kind of satisfies my need for an answer, which was that Kyle was kind of like on the edge of a small cliff or hill. And what he was trying to reach for was the branch to kind of like vault himself
heave himself over the
hill.
Edge.
And so like, I think like maybe he was able to do that. Like, as you said, when Jason lets go of his ankle, he kind of like pulls himself and he just kind of like hoists himself over the edge. And then maybe he like tumbles or falls a short distance that he's like far enough where Jason's like, well, shit, I can't get him down there. So he's going to have to like go around. But it was just confusing. I even like went back and watched it 2 or 3 times. I'm like, wait, what? How did he get away?
Mm-hmm.
Like, where did he go? And so it's just a little, and maybe it's left to be open to interpretation. But for me, I was just like, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of a clear cut, like, how did he get away?
Yeah, agreed.
So wherever he is, it's later that night, and Kyle has taken the GoPro camera, and he's giving his Heather Donahue final testimonial into the camera. I do like that. I mean, it's pretty obvious now, but he does at least acknowledge to the camera and whoever finds it that Jason is real and that you should stay away from the camp. So I do like that he's kind of presenting a warning to whoever finds it. Like, look, I wasn't expecting to find something here, but I did. And I encourage you not to make the same mistakes that I did.
I hope that he survives long enough to upload this.
Yeah, that's true. Kyle eventually makes his way back to the camp, and he does a Rambo-esque first aid on himself to patch up his cut. And I will say there's some pretty gnarly practical effects there in the stitching up of the wound, which I really liked.
Mm-hmm.
He then packs up the rest of his gear and starts to make his way through the cabin to get outside, but Jason stomps in. They get into a brief tussle, and Jason turns around to retrieve his machete, and that's when Kyle makes a break for it. So he's taking advantage of every opportunity he can to get away. It's at this point that Kyle finds an axe embedded in a tree, and while he's patching up the cut in his arm that he got just earlier from Jason's machete, Jason approaches him from behind. Jason manages to stab Kyle in the stomach with a machete, and there's this nice kind of delayed reaction where we think that Kyle has been struck with the machete and that is the extent of the injuries. Basically, they pull back and we realize that Kyle has managed to lodge the axe in Jason's left shoulder.
Yeah, I love that we never see Kyle hit Jason with that axe, but that he did it as he was being stabbed. That was a great reveal. That was really, really nicely done. And I love the black ichor that's dribbling through the holes of Jason's mask. He just really looks like this diseased, just disgusting remnant of a human being.
My second favorite part of the scene, the first being the reveal that Kyle was able to land the axe in Jason's shoulder, was that they're both laying on the ground because they're both pretty screwed up, but Kyle is the one that is able to get up first, and he turns around to see Jason removing the axe from his shoulder. And Kyle's like, fuck this.
So Jason's down for the count, and we would think that Kyle is too, but we find out that Jason managed to stab him with the machete right where he had the guidebook in his pockets.
Oh, I don't know if I noticed that.
Yeah, it was pretty cool, and it jumped out at me because for many years I worked on the Writer's Market, which is that big kind of phone book of publishing connections that aspiring writers can use to get in touch with agents, et cetera, et cetera. And it was very popular in prisons. And I found out why, because people would use it as body armor so that they wouldn't get shivved.
Jesus. Wow.
But yeah, so Kyle has been saved by his little guidebook after all.
Good catch. Wow. It's now dawn, and despite the guidebook, Kyle is in pretty bad shape, but he's manages to make his way down to the shore of the lake, and we see another crime scene ribbon there, which we obviously know as Pamela Voorhees' headless body location.
Which to me seemed a little bit far to have traveled. When you think about where Alice and Pamela were in relation to the other victims,
right,
that jumped out at me as a potential continuity error. However is right. So Kyle thinks he hears something in the woods, and when he turns around, Jason pops out of the lake and grabs Kyle by the head. And there's this pretty brutal, crunching noise as blood is streaming out of Kyle's mouth. And then Jason's is able to completely cave in Kyle's head. However, is that this was all a dream. This was the lake scene at the end. Well, as far as we know, the lake scene at the end with Alice. So Kyle is actually in an ambulance, and he's being overlooked by a paramedic named Denny, and she's telling him that he's going to be okay. And she actually turns to the other paramedic in the ambulance for confirmation, whose name is Axel, who is, of course, named after Axl Rose from Axel from the final chapter. Yeah, I mean, fair enough. They're playing with the rule book that the series has established in terms of having a dream sequence. So they're well within their rights to pull that twist. I thought it went a little bit far in terms of how lucid it seemed, but I suppose that does sell the trauma of what Kyle has just been through.
Mm-hmm. I do like that the Axel from Never Hike Alone is carrying on many of the characteristics of Axel from the final chapter. He's admiring the vintage Playboy that Kyle had actually snagged and put in his bag, which was funny. And Axel says something like, "God damn, look at the beard on that vagina," which is really weird because those are the first lines of my wedding vows.
I don't love the Axel stuff.
No, neither do I.
It's a bridge too far in terms of fan service. It's sort of like there's a discussion on Star Wars Minute, which we've said many times inspired our show, about how much fan service you can accept, and it seems like everybody agrees that there's 15% too much fan service in The Force Awakens, but no one can agree on what constitutes that 15%. For me, this is almost like when Finn pulls the little training seeker ball randomly out of a tub of junk on the Millennium Falcon. It's like, okay, we get it. We're on the Millennium Falcon. We don't need to see all of the same things. Just the fact that there's this pervert, medical person named Axel was just like a little bit eye-rolling, but fair enough.
There's a nice moment where Denny, the female paramedic, is using her pen light to check Kyle's responsiveness in his eyes. And she does this a few times, and each time is like we're getting kind of like Kyle's point of view. And as she's waving the pen light, it kind of like bleeds out the screen and you can't really see what's going on. And she does this a few times. And like the third time she does it, she pulls the pen light away and the screen goes back to the normal kind of brightness. And we see Jason is in the ambulance with them. And he's just hallucinating again. It's fine. He's been going through a lot. So I could understand that certain things would be popping to his head that wouldn't necessarily be real. But he's freaking out enough that Denny and Axel are trying to restrain him. And the back door of the ambulance opens up and it's the driver. And who is it, Greg?
Well, according to the full name that is stenciled on his jacket, it's Tommy Jarvis.
And it's actually Tommy Jarvis, played by Tom Matthews. I couldn't decide which reveal I would have liked more, if it was Corey Feldman, Tommy Jarvis, or if it was Tom Matthews, Tommy Jarvis. Like both, when I saw Tom, I was like, oh, look, it's Tommy. That's fine. But I also think it would have been pretty funny if it was Corey Feldman.
I think either way, I would have been happy. It certainly would have been great to see Corey Feldman, return as Tommy Jarvis. I always really liked Tom Matthews from Part 6, and so I was happy to see him back. And he's got a little bit more of a rugged survivor vibe than adult Corey Feldman does. Which is not to say that Corey Feldman hasn't been through some shit in his life, but. Yeah, I think that Corey Feldman might have actually come off as a little more comical than they would have intended.
Yeah. Right, that's true.
But, either way, it would have been great. I was happy to see Tommy Jarvis return. It's just, again, like, okay, if you're a fan and you're watching this movie, you're going to recognize the driver, even if his jacket just said Tommy on it. It doesn't have to say, Tommy Jarvis, survivor of Part 4 on his lapel.
Yeah, a little ham-handed, but it was still fun to see him pop up. One thing I was wondering, though, was did it make sense that Tommy grew up to be an ambulance driver or a paramedic? Like, granted, we didn't get to learn a lot about who Tommy was, at least the last time we saw him in Part 6. He was more consumed with just making sure that Jason was dead. We didn't get a lot of like career goals from him. But I was wondering, like, would he really stick around and then just drive an ambulance? Or I don't know. What do you think about that?
I had the same question, and I was going to pose the same thought to you. I kind of thought it through, and I think it's a logical choice for him to grow up to be an emergency response person. You could postulate that after his ordeals, he was helped through those situations by the first responders and may have felt an affinity for being, helping people in similar circumstances, or at least, terrible moments of their lives. Not all of them are going to be from, mass murderers, but, I could see where he would relate to being the first person to offer assistance and comfort. So that kind of made sense to me. I don't think Tommy would have stuck around to be a paramedic in Crystal Lake. That seemed a little bit odd to me. Are we to assume that he knows Jason is still out there and still on a rampage, and so he wants to be on hand to help people who might be victimized by Jason? As far as we're concerned, the last time we saw Tommy, he thinks that he put an end to Jason by chaining him to the bottom of the lake. So I would see him all right, well, I'm done with this part of the country. I'm going to go off and, help people somewhere else instead. That could use some fleshing out, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I'll buy the idea. I liked your idea of him going into like an emergency response role. That does track. If before seeing this, someone asked me what did I think Tommy Jarvis grew up to be, I'd probably say like a cop, something similar, where he's going to be in some sort of like first responder type scenario. But the other thing that kind of, and I could be overthinking it, but like the appearance of Tommy threw things off, because up until this point in the movie, we're led to believe that the only events that have happened were the Pamela Voorhees stuff, and that Jason witnessed this. Like there's no allusion to, and then he came back and he did this and did that, and then he was like found him in the lake. Like there was none of that. It was only the story about Pamela Voorhees.
Very good point.
But then suddenly it's like now Tommy's in the picture and he knows what's going on. So it's like, okay, maybe we need to learn more about what Tommy knows and what he's seen and what his role has been, because this movie posits something different. So from a fan service perspective, of course it makes sense for Tommy Jarvis to show up. And as of yet, they at least haven't established Tommy as being the same Tommy that we saw. So like, we don't know that this Tommy, the ambulance driver, went through the same shit that we saw him go through in those movies that he was in, but we are supposed to recognize him as a character. And then we find out in a few minutes that he at least recognizes Jason when he sees him. Right. So there is a connection, but up until this point, that hasn't been established. And I like to just because Kyle doesn't know about it. And that's fine. That's an easy way to write it off, is that like, Kyle has a narrow viewpoint of what the legend is, when in reality, there's a lot more to it that someone else may know, and maybe that person is Tommy. So that's fine.
Well, and it does track because, Kyle only knows about what happened at the campsite, and part 4 didn't take place at the campsite. Now, part 6 did. But yeah, I mean, to me, that this could have been intended from the very moment that Vincent DiSanti conceived of this story, and he always intended to try to have Tommy Jarvis show up at the end. To me, it felt like they were making this film, and suddenly, for whatever reason, they were able to get Tom Matthews expressed interest in like, hey, I hear you're doing this. Can I play Tommy? And they were like, oh shit, that'd be awesome. We got to throw Tommy in here. And that they didn't really have an opportunity to maybe like plan it out to the extent that they would have liked or something. Now, again, I could be completely wrong. And I think it works well enough. It certainly is a fun kind of rousing moment at the end for the fans, but it feels like your point is very valid. It brings up a lot more questions that maybe need to be worked through a little bit more.
And they may do that, and that's fine. But at least for what we're looking at now, I almost would have preferred that he was just Joe, the ambulance driver, who just happened to be played by Tom Matthews. And we're like, oh, look, it's Tom who played Tommy. Like, that is fine, because then there's no like, wait, why is Tommy there? What's he doing? What does he know? Like, it's just a nice cameo. So yeah, it's fine. Nothing that like derails it. It was just more of a like, I did kind of stop and think like, well, what is he doing there? What does he know? That type of stuff.
Yeah, I accept it. I respect it. I don't love it, but I don't hate it.
So Denny and Axel are trying to get Kyle restrained in the back of the ambulance, and while this is happening, Denny tells Tommy that she just has this feeling that Kyle was not alone in the woods. Like, someone attacked him. This was not like an injury that he suffered from hiking. So someone's out there. So Tommy goes to the front of the ambulance and gets on the radio and says that there might be another lost hiker out there, that they're going to take Kyle to the hospital, but someone else needs to come out to check on who else might be out there. And as he's doing this, we see at least Tommy acknowledge someone walking up to the side of the door. We don't see who it is, but Tommy recognizes him and goes, son of a bitch. So there's that establishment of like, Tommy knows who Jason is, or at least understands the legend of Jason enough to be familiar with him.
Then it sounds like there's some struggling off camera. We're back inside the ambulance and hearing some sort of commotion. So we're like, oh no, has Tommy been reintroduced only to get his ass kicked immediately by Jason? which, that certainly would be a shame.
Axel actually heads outside, and we only hear what's going on, but it does not sound good, whatever is going on. When he returns back to the ambulance, the back open doors of the ambulance, he has blood gushing out of his mouth and an axe stuck in his chest.
Farewell to Axel. He was played by Robert Dubois, who has a fair number of TV appearances on his IMDb page, but has not appeared in anything super huge or mainstream.
This is when Denny freaks out and she runs outside and she gets fucked up too, but we don't really see it. So Kyle is left alone in the back of the ambulance with Jason standing outside the open doors, and Jason removes the axe from Axel, and Tommy from the driver's seat turns around and looks through like the opening of the ambulance and yells to like the open back door, and he goes, "Hey, maggot head, remember me, asshole?" And then he just floors it and drives away. And I have to ask you, would you have driven away or would you have backed up and tried to run him over first?
I'm pondering, because that's a very solid question. And I'm kind of pondering, like, I think if it were me, I probably would have hit reverse and tried to at least knock him down and then take off. But I guess Tommy, probably knowing how much punishment Jason can withstand, would be afraid that he would grab on to the back of the ambulance if he were backed over and then be able to climb aboard as he sped away, going forward. So Tommy is just like, you know what, I'm just going to fucking floor it and hope I can get outside of his grasp and speed off into the night. So that's a tough call in a hard moment. I don't know.
Right. And I think the logical thing is to drive away, but I think the reason why I ask is because I was expecting him to back up. And it's like you see those scenes in movies where like someone's trying to get away and they're like, all right, floor it. And they floor it and they find out that the car's in reverse or something. And they're like, oh shit. And they got to like put it back into gear. So like I was expecting, like they had set it up, I think even with the way the camera was framed, that he was like, hey, maggot head, remember me, asshole? And I was expecting some sort of like,
retribution.
Well, I'm going to give you something to remember me by, and like back up over him. But he just takes off, and that's fine. I mean, that's probably the logical thing to do, and it's probably the safest thing to do, especially since the back doors of the ambulance were open. So Jason could have theoretically been knocked into the ambulance if he backed up. But it just kind of caught me off guard. I'm like, oh, he's just driving away. But that's the final shot. It's like a nice little drone shot of the ambulance driving off into the woods, and Jason is just kind of standing there like, well, shit.
Which, it was sort of a humorous conclusion, not like comedic, but I liked it because it was a little bit unexpected. You're right. It was a little offbeat, which is what I was hoping for from this movie. I did like it immediately left me with the impression of what they could do with a sequel is, Jason follows the ambulance into town and just starts kicking ass there.
Ooh. Yeah, it was one of the more like, at least for now, that like more definitive endings of the movie where it's like there really was nothing Jason can do, and he was just kind of resolved to that situation where he was like, he was so close to being able to get to Kyle and potentially even Tommy, but Tommy just floors it and drives off, and then Jason really is just left standing there with his dick in his hand like, well, all right. And by dick, I mean machete. But
it's a phallic symbol. Yeah, it tracks.
I liked it because it does work as an ending, but it also does set up the possibility of Jason kind of standing there like, hey, I'm letting you get away right now, but I'm going to catch you eventually.
I think we can presume that Denny was killed. She was apparently Denny Morgan, so it was Nurse Morgan and Axel from Part 4, which makes sense. She was played by Katie Schwartz, who appeared in Inherent Vice with Joaquin Phoenix, and has also been on some TV series herself. Kyle was played by Drew Lighty. He appeared in 13 Fanboy, which we'll discuss at some point in depth, and a bunch of shorts and videos. So yeah, we'll probably see him pop up in more stuff. And as we've discussed, this was written, directed, and Jason was portrayed by Vincent DiSanti, who went on to appear in 13 Fanboy himself. And an interesting fact I learned is that he's married to Sarah D. Cole, who worked in the editorial department on Into the Spider-Verse, which is one of my favorite movies ever. So we've reached the end of Never Hike Alone, but this same team comes back for a couple other pieces of fan entertainment that we'll discuss very shortly. So we'll be talking about Never Hike in the Snow, and then the short music video Disappeared. Keep an eye out for when we post that. It won't be long.
So be sure to check out Never Hike Alone on YouTube. It's pretty easy to find. There's a couple different versions of it. There's the Ghost Cut, which compiles Never Hike Alone, the music video Disappear, and Never Hike in the Snow, which we'll be discussing in the next episode, but it's pretty easy to find, but definitely check it out. And as far as the Jasons go, you can find them on Bandcamp, and they're going on tour this summer in June and July with the Queers and the Dwarves. Those are the band names, I swear. So we're going to close out this episode with a song from the Jasons. Until then, you're all doomed. Alone.
No matter what they say, it's still Crystal Lake to me. Summer's here, it's a teenage takeover. They're trying to pull off things you can't make over. Bury all the bodies in the other towns. There's still a couple hundred that they haven't found now. You can call it Camp Forest Green, Camp Blood or something in between. But that doesn't erase the history. Calling Glen dancing, well it ain't no mystery. Not to me. It's still Crystal Lake no matter what they call it. It's still Crystal Lake no matter what they call it. It's still Crystal Lake no matter what they call it. It's still Crystal Lake no matter what they call it in Part 6. A team bloodbath is a lasting marker, so you better think twice before the weekend start. Rebrand, refute, and renovate, but you can't do the business on a pile of grave. You try to keep your secrets and revive the past until it comes back to haunt you in a hockey mask. Hide and seek. It's still Crystal Lake no matter what they call it. It's still Crystal Lake no matter what they call it. It's still Crystal Lake no matter what they call it. It's still Crystal Lake no matter what they call it in Part 6. What they call it in Part 6.